Hello and welcome to the bonus interview of Your Last Gift. I am here with the author, Matthew Hutton. Matthew, thank you for joining me.
Great to be with you, Elliot.
So I suppose the first question I want to get straight to is, why did you write this book in the first place? And also, why did you then go ahead with a second edition?
Why did I write the book in the first place? Well, it goes back 4.5 years or so when my wife Annie and I had a group of friends to stay. And two of them were recent widows. And one in particular bereaved in really very, very tough circumstances. He died abroad, completely unexpected, no will. And she really had a terrible year, having to borrow off her daughters. And the other one, whose late husband was a very dear friend of mine, died of dementia. They'd sort of seen it coming. They'd made some plans. But she said to me, Matthew, if you were to write something like this, it would be a real gift to those who were left behind. So it took me some years for the idea to germinate. I was encouraged in this by the views of other people. But finally, it saw the light of day in December 2022. And the other thing to say is that, people say, what's your book about? And the short answer is death. But actually, it's not about death, because I see it really as a book about life. We make plans for all sorts of things in life. Who to marry, who to live with, whether to have children, where to live, what job to do, pastimes, volunteering, all sorts of things. And so why not make some sort of planning for what is the inevitable? And I think that's part of life. So actually what I say, it's a book about life. And then why did I write a second edition? Well, it became clear, I think, over the course of 2023, that there were other things I could have put in. I went to visit our local hospice, for example, the Priscilla Bacon Lodge in Norwich, and had conversations with people there about the experience of patients. I realised I could have put in more about pensions, for example, and there are other things. So I thought it was worth bringing out a second edition, which I did in March 2024, not adding a huge amount, about 10%, because I still wanted it to be concise but comprehensive. And if anybody's listening to this and thinking, oh, rats, I bought the first edition, all is not lost, because if you go to the website and if you go to updates, you'll find all the detail of the new material that I put in the second edition. So you've still got your money's worth.
Wow. And did it take a long time to initially write, or was it one of those, I've got this idea, I'm going to get my head down and off I go?
Yeah, it more or less sort of fell off the blocks, actually. And I wanted the strapline concise but comprehensive. So it wasn't going to be something that was long, but it needed to get the essential information in a fairly readable form. And I hope that it's done that.
Are you finding that more and more people are being less prepared for death now when it comes to their wills? Is it a generation thing? Is it getting worse?
I don't think it's getting worse. I mean, the statistic is that 3 in 5 of all UK adults haven't made a will. And I think that's probably about the same. I mean, the thing that has changed, and this is probably COVID, is that people are talking much more about it. And that's a good thing. And there was that astonishing finding. The Christian think tank Theos published a report called Faith, Love and Hope last November. And they find that 25% of us think about our own death at least once a week, which I find astonishing. And so I suppose one's sort of building into that and saying, well, what are you going to do about it?
Well, there's some things that I'd love to know more. So what are lasting powers of attorney, and why is it almost as important as the will itself?
Well, of course, lasting powers of attorney kick in before you die. Will kicks in after you die. And what lasting powers of attorney are there to do? And there are two of them. There's one of property and financial affairs, the other health and welfare. Very often you might have the same people appointed as attorneys under each, is to cater for the situation where you're no longer able to make decisions for yourself. Could be loss of mental capacity, could be loss of physical capacity. And if you don't have things like this in place, then you're in a terrible situation. And there's something called the court of protection to which you have to apply. It's a very lengthy and expensive process. And until you do that, effectively your affairs are left in limbo. I mean, probably a hospital will take into account the express wishes of next of kin, but it's not at all satisfactory. So that's why it's sensible for everybody, because none of us knows, A, how long we're going to live, what's going to happen to health, to make lasting powers of attorney.
Well, that's actually what I was going to move on to, is that when is it an age thing? Because I think a lot of people think, well, probably I'll get to my late 60s, 70s, and then I'll start thinking about having a will, but it shouldn't be like that. Is that right?
It shouldn't be like that at all. And the reason it shouldn't be like that is that if you die without a will, then there are things called the intestacy. Intestacy means dying without a will, provisions laid down under the law, which determine who gets what. And everybody thinks they sort of know what would happen. Well, it will all go to my other half. Well, it will if your other half is your spouse or civil partner. It won't apply if your other half is somebody you live with, but is neither spouse or civil partner. And if you've got children, then that surviving spouse or civil partner will only get personal chattels, that's possessions. They'll get what's called the statutory legacy of £322,000. They'll get half of what's left, and the other half of what's left will go to the children at age 18. So if you're quite rich, that could have the undesirable consequence of children getting far too much at too young an age. And also for inheritance tax purposes, and inheritance tax or death duties has been my particular favourite subject for a long time, will then kick in, whereas it might needed not have kicked in at that point. If surviving you is children or grandchildren, then they will take. If you don't have spouse, civil partner or children, then it's your parents. If parents aren't living, then brothers and sisters, and so on. And if you've got no blood relatives surviving, then King Charles III, or at least the crown, is the lucky recipient.
Yeah, I believe there's something similar to music where all of the royalties that's floating around, they say, oh, it all goes to John Lennon.
And so the importance of making a will, which is probably your next question, is this. First of all, you say who gets what, and you do that, obviously, with inheritance tax efficiency. You say whether you want to be buried or cremated and where. Almost most importantly, you appoint executors, one or more, who are the people who will look after your affairs after you've died. And there'll be people you trust completely. It could be a surviving spouse, could be children, could be a family friend. I would say it shouldn't be a firm of solicitors, being a retired solicitor, or a bank, but it should be people close to the family, particularly who you can trust, and particularly who will make the right sort of decisions.
I can see just by speaking to you here how important it is to get an expert involved.
Yeah.
Because it's a minefield. I think that most people would be sitting there going, oh, like you said, oh, it'll go to my partner or something. And it just sounds like a minefield. And that's one of the great things about the documents and the sheets that you've got via your website, which people can go and access. And was that deliberate just to help people navigate their way through?
Yes. I mean, I wanted to write a book about the whole process of what happens after you die. Because what you find very often is when people are bereaved of somebody close to them for the first time, of course, that they're devastated. They're having to deal with the grief of bereavement. And then there's all this practical stuff, whether it's dealing with HMRC, the revenue, whether it's dealing with things like digital assets. Maybe both of you are died and they're minor children or pets or dependent relatives. There's a whole host of stuff that has to be dealt with. And it can completely knock the stuffing out of you. So I think it's so important to set things up in advance. And so that's why what the book does is effectively point to the forms and the checklists which set the information out that people have access to.
What would you say to someone who is disinclined to start creating their will today?
I mean, one interesting thought is why they're disinclined. And it might be they say, I'm too young, it won't happen to me, I haven't got anything to leave. Um, but all those reasons you can counter, because the fact is none of us knows when it is going to happen. And yes, we all hope we're going to live to a ripe old age and die on our beds. But if it does happen when it's unexpected, and however much you've got to leave, you do want to make sure both that the people you want to look after your affairs, that is your executors, and those who will benefit are those that you've chosen. So I just think it's so important, and it's not that complicated. It's really quite straightforward. I mean, it is interesting that people supposedly think it's supposedly don't like thinking about their deaths, but actually the evidence is we do.
Okay, so let's just say I'm going to go and create a will. Um, what's normally contained in a will? Um, and what are executors?
Yeah. Well, a will start by saying, "This is my last will and testament." It says, "I revoke all previous wills." You might not have made a previous will. Uh, it gives your name and address. It gives your wish typically to be buried or cremated, and if so, where. And then it appoints executors. And executors are the people who, once probate has been granted, and what probate is the court saying this will is valid. And these people are named as executors in the will, and they have the authority of the court to deal with the assets and the liabilities and to distribute them according to the terms of the will. So it's a really important job. And you appoint people you trust. It could be a surviving spouse or partner, could be children, could be a family friend. So that's the first thing. And then you make a series of gifts. You might make some cash gifts to favorite people. You might make gifts to charity. You might make bequests, which are gifts of things. Might be valuable things, might be a painting, for example, to particularly favorite people. And then you make the gift of residue. And residue is effectively what's left after everything has been taken out, after debts have been paid, including to HMRC. And you provide for who gets residue. And it might be a surviving spouse, it might be adult children, it might be younger children under the age of 18, in which case there has to be a trust until they attain the age of 18. And then there's a whole range of administrative powers, which used to be set out in full, but now you refer to through a form created by STEP, which is the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners. And that, to somebody who's not used to these things, that sounds very complicated. But for somebody like me, for whom it was bread and butter for many years, it's very straightforward and it needn't cost a lot of money.
Well, I'm laughing. I've got a smile on my face because I'm literally sitting here thinking, I wish I could dive in your mind. I mean, it's amazing how you can reel all of this off. It's really, really helpful advice. Can we backtrack a fraction? You mentioned about probate.
Yeah.
And it's obviously extremely important. Could you just dive into that a little bit more? So what exactly is it and why is it so important?
Well, probate's important because if the executors named in the will don't have probate, and incidentally, if there isn't a will, and in other words, if you're the 1 in 3 in 5 people who haven't made a will, then the people who are entitled under the intestacy rules can apply to be what's called administrators, who do the same job as executors. Is that unless you have executors or administrators, you might go to a bank or a building society or to the land registry in the case of property and say, we want to transfer Whiteacre or whatever the house was called to the beneficiaries, and you won't be able to. In other words, there is no legal right to do that. That's why it's so important. It's not required in every case. In other words, if what you own is, for example, jointly owned, might be cash or building society accounts, or it might be a house and you jointly own it with your spouse or civil partner, then it passes what's called by operation of law by survivorship. So you don't need probate there. You don't need probate if the amounts are very small. Banks or building societies have their own level. It might be £5,000, £10,000 that they will transfer without a grant of probate. But in almost every case, you need probate.
I see.
So it's key.
Yes, well,
Yeah.
it sounds it.
Yeah.
It sounds it.
Yeah.
So I'm in a relationship. I'm married. I've got a couple of kids.
Yeah.
And we don't know who's going to go first.
No.
Nobody does.
No.
So let's just say, what can I do, or what can we do to best help provide in the future for the other person?
Yeah. Well, I think talk about it, first of all. And of course, it's not a matter of age or of gender or of health. You simply don't know. So I think you probably have to cater for the possibility that either might go first. And interestingly, I've put a new bit in the book about saying it's not just about providing financially, but that's important. And providing financially, what I suggest is you have a joint bank account, which you may have anyway. But if not, then the advantage of a joint bank account or a joint building society account is that you don't have to wait for probate, because that will pass automatically. So first of all, you need to ensure that the survivor, whoever he or she is, and particularly if they're not the breadwinner, has enough to live on. And secondly, you need to ask yourself the question, well, who runs the show? What do people do? And you can be quite stereotyped that one of you does one sort of thing about the house and the other of you does the other thing. So, for example, if there's one of you, and I'm not saying who it is, does all the cooking and the other one does all the washing up, which generally is true in our case. So my wife Annie does all the cooking and I do the washing up. It's much easier to learn how to do the washing up than it is cooking. I need to learn how to cook in case she goes first. If one of you deals with all the financial things and they go first, then you don't want to leave the other high and dry. So you need to talk about it, and you can have quite a bit of fun, teaching each other and maybe sharing jobs in future, which is also a very good role model for the children.
Yes, quite.
So,
one last question, Matthew, before I let you go. I think I know what the answer is, but if there was one takeaway from this book that you want people to, they've read the book, they've listened to the audiobook, and you want them to walk away with one little golden takeaway, what would it be?
am I allowed 3? I have got...
Well, all right.
Okay, all right. Yeah, sorry, I'm a lawyer, so I'm used to negotiating.
Well, in which case, I'm not even going to fight you on it.
No, I think what I would say is what I call the 3 essentials. And so the 3 essentials are powers of attorney that we talked about, will, which we talked about, and funeral arrangements. In other words, saying what you would like to happen, and if there's going to be a service in a church, or if there's going to be a memorial meeting, or if there's going to be a party. And the reason I say the last one is because I've found, as an ordained minister in the Church of England, if the person who's died has said in advance, actually, these are my wishes, this is what I'd like to happen, A, it takes a burden off those who are left, and B, they take huge pleasure in the thought that they're carrying out what he or she would have wanted. So I think I would say the 3 essentials in response to your question.
Matthew Hutton, thank you so much for doing this interview.
Thank you, Elliot.